The protagonist's morning began abruptly, not with the sound of an alarm clock, but with the shrill, angry screams of his neighbor, Karen. He rushed to the window to see her standing at the edge of his property, her face flushed with rage. Her SUV was stuck in a deep trench that had been dug around his driveway, its wheels spinning uselessly in the mud. Karen's voice carried across the yard as she hurled accusations and insults at him. As he stood there, watching her struggle, memories of their past conflicts flooded his mind. Karen had always been a thorn in his side, constantly criticizing his property and reporting him to the HOA for the smallest infractions. Whether it was the height of his grass, the color of his fence, or the placement of his trash bins, Karen had made it her mission to make his life difficult. The HOA, under her influence, had become a tool for her to exert control over the neighborhood. This latest incident, however, felt different. The trench around his driveway was no accident, it was a deliberate act, a response to months of harassment. But as Karen's screams grew louder, the protagonist realized that this was only the beginning of a much larger conflict. The tension between the protagonist and Karen had been simmering for months, but it reached a boiling point one morning when he found her SUV parked directly in front of his driveway. She stood nearby, arms crossed, a smug expression on her face. When he confronted her, Karen explained that the HOA had deemed his driveway non-compliant with their standards. According to her, it was too wide, too narrow, or simply not up to code. The specifics didn't matter. What mattered was that she had the authority to enforce these rules, and she was determined to make him suffer for it. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. By the way, what city are you watching us from? Write it in the comments, we're curious. The protagonist tried to reason with her, but Karen was unmoved. When he attempted to tow her vehicle out of the way, she threatened him with fines and legal action. Her words were laced with venom, and it was clear that she enjoyed the power she held over him. Frustrated and angry, the protagonist realized that he couldn't win this battle through conventional means. If Karen and the HOA were going to play dirty, he would have to find a way to fight back on his own terms. Determined to stand his ground, the protagonist began researching local laws and HOA regulations. He spent hours poring over legal documents, zoning codes, and property rights. His efforts paid off when he discovered a little-known loophole in the local ordinances. While the HOA could regulate the appearance of his driveway, they had no authority over the land surrounding it. If he wanted to dig a trench around his property, there was nothing they could do to stop him. Armed with this knowledge, the protagonist wasted no time. He rented excavation equipment and began digging a deep, wide trench around his driveway. The work was grueling, but the thought of Karen's reaction kept him motivated. When she finally saw what he had done, her face turned red with fury. She screamed at him, threatened him, and even called the police, but there was nothing she could do. The trench was perfectly legal, and the protagonist had the documents to prove it. Karen's shock and outrage were satisfying, but the protagonist knew this was only the first step. If he wanted to truly protect his property and his peace of mind, he would need to take things even further. With the trench in place, the protagonist turned his attention to his next project, a drawbridge. The idea was both practical and symbolic, a way to secure his property while sending a clear message to Karen and the HOA that he wouldn't be pushed around. He spent days designing the structure, carefully calculating the dimensions and mechanics to ensure it would function smoothly. When construction began, Karen's anger reached new heights. She stood at the edge of his property, shouting insults and threats as he worked. She even tried to rally the other neighbors against him, but most of them were tired of her constant meddling and refused to get involved. Undeterred, the protagonist continued building, piece by piece, until the drawbridge was complete. The final product was impressive, a sturdy, functional bridge that could be raised and lowered at will. When Karen saw it, she was speechless. Her attempts to intimidate him had failed, and she knew it. The drawbridge was a physical manifestation of his defiance, a symbol of his refusal to bow to her authority. But as the protagonist stood there, admiring his handiwork, he knew the battle was far from over. Karen wasn't the type to give up easily, and he could feel the storm brewing on the horizon. The war between them was just beginning, and he was ready to fight. The completion of the drawbridge marked a turning point in the conflict. The protagonist now had full control over access to his property, and Karen's attempts to block his driveway were rendered useless. But Karen wasn't one to back down. One evening, as the protagonist was testing the drawbridge mechanism, he heard a loud crash. Rushing outside, he found Karen attempting to sabotage the bridge, using a crowbar to pry open the locking mechanism. The protagonist quickly grabbed his phone and began recording. Karen, oblivious to being filmed, continued her destructive efforts, shouting obscenities and threats. When she finally noticed the camera, her face twisted in rage, but it was too late. The footage was damning, capturing her in the act of vandalism and trespassing. The protagonist called the police, and Karen was arrested on the spot. The incident became the talk of the neighborhood. Karen's actions, once seen as merely overbearing, were now viewed as outright criminal. The video spread quickly, and the protagonist found himself with an unexpected wave of support from his neighbors, many of whom had also suffered under Karen's reign. The video of Karen's arrest went viral, shared across social media platforms and even picked up by local news outlets. The story of the man who built a drawbridge to defend his property against an overzealous HOA president captured the public's imagination. Memes, hashtags, and even parody videos began circulating, turning the protagonist into an unlikely internet hero. Karen, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. Embarrassed and furious, she shifted her tactics. Instead of direct confrontation, she began targeting the protagonist through the HOA, issuing fines for trivial violations. She convinced the remaining board members to file noise complaints, citing the construction of the drawbridge as a disturbance. She even tried to rally support by painting herself as the victim, claiming the protagonist was harassing her. But her efforts were increasingly transparent. The neighbors, many of whom had seen the viral video, were no longer willing to side with her. The protagonist, meanwhile, remained calm and collected, knowing that Karen's desperation was a sign of her weakening position. Realizing that Karen's power stemmed from her position in the HOA, the protagonist decided to strike at the root of the problem. He began gathering evidence of her misconduct, meticulously documenting every fine, complaint, and interaction. He reached out to neighbors, many of whom shared their own stories of Karen's abuse of power. He discovered that she had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, from home renovations to luxury vacations. At an emergency HOA meeting, Karen attempted to turn the tables, accusing the protagonist of violating numerous bylaws. But when it was his turn to speak, he presented his evidence, receipts, bank statements, and testimonies from neighbors. The room fell silent as he laid bare Karen's corruption. The board members, many of whom had been unaware of her actions, were stunned. The protagonist's presentation was a bombshell. He detailed Karen's fraudulent fines, her misuse of HOA funds, and her attempts to intimidate and control the neighborhood. The evidence was overwhelming, and the board had no choice but to take action. Karen was removed from her position as HOA president, and an investigation was launched into her financial misconduct. The authorities soon got involved, and Karen's SUV, the same one that had been stuck in the trench, was towed away as part of the investigation. It became a symbol of her downfall, a stark reminder of how far she had fallen. The neighbors, once cowed by her authority, now openly mocked her, and Karen became a pariah in the community. Despite her removal from the HOA, Karen refused to go quietly. She launched a campaign of harassment against the protagonist, sending anonymous messages and filing fake complaints with local authorities. She even escalated to physical sabotage, cutting the ropes of the drawbridge in the middle of the night. But the protagonist was prepared. He installed security cameras around his property, capturing every attempt Karen made to intimidate or harm him. When she cut the drawbridge ropes, the footage was sent directly to the police. Karen was arrested again, this time for criminal mischief and trespassing. The arrest was the final blow. With Karen's reputation in tatters and the evidence against her mounting, the remaining HOA members voted to expel her from the association entirely. The storm she had tried to unleash had backfired, leaving her isolated and powerless. The protagonist, meanwhile, emerged victorious. His drawbridge became a symbol of resilience and defiance, and his story inspired others to stand up against petty tyranny. The neighborhood, freed from Karen's control, began to heal, and the protagonist finally felt at peace in his home. With Karen gone, the HOA began to unravel. The remaining board members, many of whom had been complicit in her actions, resigned one by one. The neighborhood, tired of the constant drama and petty rules, began to question the need for an HOA at all. A meeting was called to discuss the future of the association, and the turnout was overwhelming. The protagonist, now a local hero, stood up to speak. He argued that the HOA had become a tool for control and harassment, rather than a means of maintaining the community. His words resonated with the crowd, and when the vote was called, the decision was clear: the HOA would be dissolved. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The protagonist, feeling a sense of closure, decided to commemorate the end of the HOA's tyranny in a unique way. He commissioned a small plaque and installed it near the entrance to his property. The inscription read, "In memory of the tyranny we overcame." May this serve as a reminder that no one should have the power to control how we live in our own homes. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video to show your support.